After a terrible disaster, you find yourself lost in space, with only your chicken for company. You must scavenge, you must survive, and you must find a way back to civilization before people, notice that you're gone and then reassign your parking spot, and then that's a whole thing. Breathedge is a first-person survival and simulation game. Like other games of its type, your main focus is on exploring your environment so that you can collect resources, which you can then use to craft equipment, consumables, items, or structures. Building better gear will allow you to explore more dangerous areas and find more valuable resources, but as a survival game, you'll also need to manage your health, hunger, and thirst, or else it's game over. Now, the most obvious distinction of Breathedge is that instead of being set on an island or a jungle or even on a planet, this one takes place in space. At the start of the game, the ship that you're on explodes and you are left stranded in its vast debris field, which means that collecting resources revolves around exploring this vast field while also managing your limited oxygen supply. Now, unfortunately, the quality of Breathedge is a little hard to parse out, because if I had to describe the game in only the most general terms, this would be a glowing endorsement, because there's a lot to like here. But as soon as I have to drill down into any specifics, things get a lot more murky. A good example of what I'm talking about is the game's fundamental movement, that because it takes place in space, you are unrestricted by gravity. You can move in any direction, go almost anywhere you want. And the result is that there's a lot of freedom, both in how the environment is laid out and how you are allowed to explore it. But it's also not an intuitive system. It takes a little while to get used to, and navigating your way around free-floating obstacles can be somewhat of a challenge. Also, your character and the objects they touch keep their momentum, so accidentally colliding with something, say a resource that you're trying to collect, can inadvertently send it flying off in a different direction. Another good example of what I'm trying to explain is the game's visual design. Overall, the game's level and environmental design is very strong. That even though you're in space and able to look and move in almost any direction you want, the game manages to keep you oriented by making sure that there are very specific landmarks scattered around the area, that various structures are easily identifiable from a distance, and that different areas have their own unique designs and even color palettes. But while the environments might look great, on a more player interactive scale, the visual design is not good. A huge problem is identifying minute details, especially resources, at a distance. Most of the materials that you can collect, whether it be metal or fabric or resin, are just small gray spheres floating in the void. And they are very hard to identify when your background is either A, the gray hull of a ship, B, the gray surface of an asteroid, or C, the inky blackness of space. The best example of this is resource nodes, which you occasionally find embedded into various asteroids. Not only are they hard to pick out from just the gray surface area of the asteroids themselves, but the nodes look legitimately identical until you have your face pressed against them. But the ultimate example of the game's overall design being sabotaged by its specifics is the pacing of the game. As Breathedge opens, it follows a fairly familiar formula, but it has pretty much everything that you could want out of a survival and exploration game. You find yourself stuck in the starting area with plentiful resources and a few basic crafting recipes available to you. You need to gather materials and craft tools and equipment which will allow you to travel further away from your home base and gather additional resources. As you explore, you might pick up bits of the story in the form of audio or text logs, but more importantly, you'll find additional recipes that you can craft. First, you find new tools, which allow you to collect more exotic materials. Then you find upgrades for your suit, which allows you to travel into more dangerous zones. And after that, you start unlocking real utility recipes, things like vehicles and even habitats, which you're free to build almost anywhere and can be upgraded with additional sections or customizations, and you can even use it as a forward operating base, which expands the overall area that you're capable of exploring. And for the first half of the game, all of this goes by flawlessly. Breathedge has an excellent core gameplay loop of exploration, collecting, and crafting. And then you reach the second half of the game, and none of that matters. And at this point you might be thinking, oh well, isn't that kind of natural? That in most survival crafting games, once you reach the highest technology level, there isn't really much left to do, as you've essentially reached the endgame. And you could be forgiven for thinking that, but in Breathedge, the actual reason is much stranger. Essentially, your goal in the first half is to find a working spaceship so that you can use that ship to travel to new areas of the game's world map. However, when you reach these new areas, you discover that unlike the first area of the game, which is a large, interconnected, open environment where you can explore and build and craft at your leisure, these new areas are much more isolated zones where you will typically dock with a spaceship and then explore a linear corridor, typically with the only goal of collecting some bit of story info so that you can then go back to your ship and then travel to the next docking point. And even in the rare case when you pick up a new recipe, they're typically not for increasing your overall functionality. Instead, they're almost exclusively one-time use items that you need to open a door or bypass an obstacle just so that you can reach the next linear corridor. And the result is what feels like a massive misrepresentation of the game's content. That you spend the entire first half of the game exploring, crafting, surviving in the cold darkness of space by your wits alone, and then you spend the second half of the game walking through one hallway after another with the occasional cutscene thrown in. And I suppose I have to admit that the second half of the game isn't without innovation. They do start adding in combat segments where you have to either use your ship or your handheld weaponry to defeat some basic grunt enemies, but even then, it's not adding anything to the core gameplay loop. It's not expanding the difficulty. These combat segments are just minor obstacles that you have to complete in order to get to the next linear corridor segment. And what's really crazy is there's not even any reason to go back. That even though in the second half you'll typically have to craft, say, a key in order to open a door, you might presume that perhaps you'll need to travel back to the first area and use all of the resource collection and crafting supplies that you accumulated up until that point. But instead, in an act of what I can only assume is either convenience or maybe just laziness, the game will often just drop whatever you need right next to you in the corridor, so that you can just craft what you need and keep going. Which means that if you did spend the time and effort to reach the top of the technology tree and perhaps even make your own customized space station, I mean, good job, but it turns out all that stuff was entirely irrelevant to reaching the end of the game. As I've tried to explain here, the result is that the pacing of the game is just so strange. I mean, try to imagine that you're playing a traditional platforming game, a Mario or a Crash Bandicoot and the like, and you get to the midway point and all of a sudden it just switches into a visual novel. There's no more running, there's no more jumping. From that point on, it's 100% dialogue and text prompts, and that's it. You would presumably find that transition somewhat jarring, and that is the exact problem with Breathedge. The survival mechanics, the crafting, the exploration, all of that works really well, and I enjoyed the hell out of it, but that praise can only apply to the first half of the game. Once you get to the second half, it transforms into a linear adventure game and nothing else. It's funny, there's a point at the very start of the game where the quest system gives you the objective to build this useless hunk of junk as basically just a confirmation that the quest system itself works. And after it's done, they throw in a little joke about how, sometimes lazy developers will just throw in arbitrary objectives to give the player something to do. And at the time, I thought this was a cute little piece of satire about how, in an open world game, stuff like this would never happen. You're free to explore and adventure and go wherever you want. Little did I realize that this was actually a tragic prophecy of the game's ultimate objectives. Now here's the thing, if you've played maybe a couple hours, or if you've watched a trailer or seen a couple of gameplay videos, you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute now, this looks great. It seems to have everything I could want out of an open world survival crafting game. At which point I would respond, oh no, I completely understand your perspective. The first half of Breathedge is fantastic, and it does indeed have everything you could want out of a game like that. Until you reach about the midway point, and everything you've done up until then becomes irrelevant. As I said before, this is a game that vastly misrepresents its core content. In the end, I would give Breathedge 3 out of 4 stars, but unless you don't have the time or the inclination to play the entire way through and for some reason stop midway, I really wouldn't recommend it. Alright, well, thanks for listening. Maybe next time I'll find something to be more excited about. Like this guy is, and oh geez, slow down there, buddy. Alright, till next time.